Okay. Good morning and welcome to Hofstra University. My name is Jace Bernhardt and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geology, Environment, and Sustainability and director of Hofstra's new meteorology minor. Today's keynote speaker for our symposium, entitled Long Island Hurricanes on the 80th Anniversary of the 1938 Storm, Past, Present, and Future, is Dr. Louis Uccellini. Dr. Uccellini is a Long Island native and currently serves as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Assistant Administrator for Weather Services and Director of the U.S. National Weather Service. He is responsible for the day-to-day civilian weather operations for the United States, its territories, adjacent waters, and ocean areas. Prior to this position, Dr. Uccellini served in many other leading roles, including Director of the National Centers for Environmental Prediction for 14 years. Dr. Uccellini received his PhD, master's, and bachelor's degrees in meteorology, all from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on myriad topics in atmospheric science, and is co-author of the widely acclaimed 2-volume American Meteorological Society monograph, Northeast Snowstorms, published in 2004 with Paul Cosin. The book is currently for sale here, and Dr. Uccellini will be available for signings after his keynote address. Dr. Uccellini has received several prestigious awards while also serving as president of the American Meteorological Society in 2012 and 2013. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Louis Uccellini to Hofstra University and back home to Long Island.
Well, thank you, and it's certainly a thrill to be back home, meeting with the family last night. Thank you, Lenny. I would like to start off today by first asking how many retired National Weather Service employees do we have here in the audience? Two. And how many current National Weather Service employees? Okay, why don't you folks stand up? You too, Chris. These are the reasons I come to work every day. All right? And to the retired folks, all I can say is that you did great work. You built a solid foundation for these folks that are standing behind you and next to you. And you'll see as we get to the end of this talk, it's not your weather service anymore. It's quite a bit has changed. So thank you very much for your services. And a slight introduction of me. I did grow up on Long Island in Bethpage. Bethpage was pretty close to where Donna passed over in 1960. And then in December of 60, January 61, February 61, we had 3 of the best snowstorms you ever want to have, okay? And I was hooked forever. I mean, I grew up loving weather. I told my parents when I was about 5 or 6 years old I was going to be a meteorologist. I visited the Garden City office here, the regional office. I was told by the first person who met me as a high school student, don't go into meteorology, there's no future for you in meteorology. And the second person told me to go to the University of Wisconsin. So I shocked my family, left Long Island, and wound up going out to Madison. And the main reason is that's where Professor Sumi was spinning up the whole satellite world. And the person who talked to me, I don't remember his name, of course, said that that's the future of meteorology, is satellites. So got my degree there and wound up at NASA for 11 years and then came over to the Weather Service. So today, I can tell you that my interest was in hurricanes and snowstorms here, but my research has been in jet streaks, gravity waves, and snowstorms. So I really felt a little uneasy in accepting this invitation because I didn't really know that much about hurricanes, but I assure you that I've spent the last 7, 8, 9 months reading and preparing for this, and I came across Avila's book. If we can get to my slides here. I don't fat finger anybody else's systems, so it was up. There we go. So Laura DeVilas, we heard of this morning. Charles discovered her book, and I went through that cover to cover. So for those folks who haven't bought her book yet, if you really want to know what went on in this storm, that's the one you want to get. With respect to my book, the one I did with Paul Coulson, I don't get a dime for it, so I'm not here hawking any book. But if you're into the synoptics of East Coast snowstorms, that's the one. So I'll be here until about 1:30 or 2 before I have to rush back to Washington. But perfectly willing to sign if you're interested. So this is the outline. It looks pretty long. Do the warm-up, prologue, the storm characteristics, destruction aftermath, the forecast, which, okay, here's the news bulletin for you. There was no warning for a hurricane, so you can understand the impact and the surprise that it had on the folks. I do want to build into today's forecast process and how we're working to build a weather-ready nation. The bottom line there is we're going beyond the forecasts and warnings and connecting with decision makers. So for those students in the room, it's a combination of human factors, social science, and physical science now that gets us there. So that's the bottom line on that. Can it happen again? And then the summary. So let's talk about this here. Can we get sound on this? We didn't test that. We're going to go back.
For 2 days, the coast from New Jersey to New England felt its full fury. New York was a city of deluge, as 70-mile-an-hour winds whipped torrential rains for hour after hour. It turned streets into rivers and slowed the pulse of the city. The hurricane center cut north across Long Island, and damage to suburban areas was staggering. Drains and sewer systems were useless, and the raging seas poured millions of tons of water far inland. Fire compounded the disastrous ravages of the hurricane. In New London, Connecticut, for example, the waterfront was gutted. Blocked roads isolated the community. No help could reach the beleaguered firemen. As the storm spiraled out to sea, there was a sad inventory to take in the eastern states. From Atlantic City to Twin Mountain, New Hampshire, the hurricane had left a trail of devastation. $300 million was a conservative estimate of the damage. 600 people were dead, and the task of rebuilding taxed the resources of town and hamlet. Wrecked fishing craft and pleasure boats numbered in the thousands. Not one port along the Atlantic coast escaped the wrath of the hurricane. Against nature's fury, man had no defense. He could only flee to safety, leaving possessions behind. This Long Island train was tossed from the tracks like a toy. The hurricane of 1938 was the worst storm to hit the eastern coast in recorded history. But it ushered in a new era of scientific storm warnings. Probably no future storm will ever take such a toll.
That's a remarkable statement for 1938, okay, that last part there. When I heard that, I was like, By the way, for the students in the room, you got that news about a week after the event. You know, not instantaneous now, nobody's cell phones. And I think getting the magnitude of this event really came across from that. But the fact is, it really was part of our family lore as well. I heard about this storm every time we crossed the Shinnecock Canal. My father said this wasn't here before the 38 storm, and this was being said in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And my mother grew up in Farmingdale, and they only talked about two storms, the 1938 hurricane and the 1947 snowstorm after Christmas. And both of them are marked by total surprise and a total shutdown, basically, of the areas affected. So we have that family law as well. But the prologue of this is this quote, "It doesn't happen in New England, the curse of the forecast techniques based on climatology and persistence." This played a very important role in the forecasting as it existed for this storm. So keep that in mind as we're moving forward. And there was also this focus on Florida. Why? Because in 1935, they had a similar situation with in this case, a Category 5 storm that hit the Keys. The lack of situational awareness is one of the issues that contributed to the high death tolls in both of these storms and the storm surge associated with that. So there was a real focus on that particular storm as we approach this one. So with respect to it can't happen here, we're looking at this chart. This comes from Avila's book, and one of the things and she noted this in the panel discussion, when you look at all the storms, these three storms really pop up. It's really interesting when you read the history of this. Benjamin Franklin and others described the storms in the 17th and 18th centuries. They got really interested in the fact that storms would affect Virginia or Philadelphia before they affected New England. How could that happen with a northeast wind? Okay, I mean, these are the kinds of questions that people who were interested in weather were asking themselves. And the 1821, the Redfield storm was noted in terms of circulation, very controversial. Espy tried to skin this guy alive for suggesting that the air moved around the storms in a counterclockwise way because everything was straight line winds, right? I mean, this is the way they viewed it. The main thing is 113 years separated the 1815 and or 123 years, sorry, can't even add, the 1938 storms. So the fact is, nobody had any kind of experience with this. So it can't happen here. It's something that not only permeated the society, but it permeated the forecasters as well. So the focus on the Florida. This storm right here, which amplified to a Category 5 as it approached the Keys. And this is written up by a recent book by Thomas Neal Knowles called Category 5. It's really a great book. They actually lost track of that storm in that real small area. So imagine what forecasters had to do with storms coming across the Atlantic. They didn't know it was a 5 until it was actually hitting the Keys, or at that level. Of course, we didn't have the necessary studies done to actually go to the 1 through 5, but they lost their situational awareness with respect to where the storm was and how intense it was. And it struck the Florida Keys now. It's one of the few storms that's actually struck the U.S. mainland as a Cat 5. One of the big tragedies of this was the storm surge of 15 to 20 feet knocked that train over. There were World War I veterans that were part of the construction areas along in the Keys that they were trying to evacuate but waited too long. When that train got swept off the tracks, 251 veterans were killed just in this incident. Okay? And then if you look at the actual damage, it's just really incredible what that storm did. So this is baked in to people's minds as the 38th storm was crossing the Atlantic. So here's the 38th storm coming across. You can understand now why the focus is on Florida, and we'll go over the forecast process in a minute. But it's one of these Cape Verde storms that's crossing. A couple of ships' reports identifies that there's a storm out there. They don't know exactly where until it gets about halfway across the Atlantic. And then they're hoping for the curve, seeing signs of the curves, forecasting it. And of course, these types of storms generally come up and then continue the turn out to the east. This storm didn't do that. Okay? And that, in a nutshell, is the forecast issue for the Washington office. So with this, the maximum intensity was a Cat 5 out in the middle of the ocean. But when it got to the landfall, it was designated as a Cat 3, probably a high Cat 3 as we're understanding. The death toll is in the 600 to 800 range. I've seen numbers in the 700s, but there's discussion of even with these types of storms, exactly how many people were killed directly by the storm. One of the things they note, if this had happened several weeks earlier, when there were many more people on summer vacation, the death toll they are estimating would have been in the thousands. Okay. Or if it had shifted another 20 or 30 miles, it would have been that much more impactful. Now, this is a post-storm surface analysis, and this was done by Charles Pierce. We'll get to him in a minute. But you can see from this analysis, really remarkable sets of analysis that are done by Pierce. There's this transformation that's going on with this nice inverted trough, and we'll see that now we look at this as part of what we call an extratropical transition. The other thing to note and is not only does the intensity maintaining itself, and it's not just because it didn't spend much time over colder water. Usually these storms, if they move more slowly, they spend more time over the colder water and they start losing their intensity. But as we'll see, it's going, as part of this extratropical transition, it's now drawing from a different energy source related to the temperature gradients. But here it is, and at 7:30 in the morning, it's still pretty far south. It's south of the Virginia-North Carolina border, and then it rapidly accelerates on up the coast. And accelerating storms are more impactful to the coastal areas that they intersect at a perpendicular line. So this was a perfect setup for eastern Long Island and southeastern New England. There's a really beautiful picture of it at 2 p.m. As it's approaching the coast. At this time, warnings had been issued for a whole gale, but there was never a hurricane warning actually issued for Long Island. They were getting a better sense of this storm moving up the coast rather than going out to sea, but they still thought that it would lose its intensity as it approached Long Island, even as they put out the warnings. So we had record wind speeds that were measured. It's still the record for Blue Hill Observatory, for example. Record storm surge for Long Island and for Rhode Island, as we heard. Torrential heavy rains. The inland flooding was incredible with this one. And, it was catastrophic inland flooding. We'll show some examples of that. And all of this was not warned for. Every aspect of that, what we see on here, was not specifically warned for. So people not only along the coast, but inland were caught totally by surprise by what would be catastrophic ingredients. So the destruction, deaths, this is from the Weather Bureau review, it's a 700. Homeless, about 63,000. Homes and buildings destroyed, approaching 9,000. Trees, 2 billion trees. 2 billion trees. That's really incredible. Boats lost or destroyed, about 3,300. So this is the cost of it. And again, people have done studies with this. They continue to do studies. A slight shift to the west, the cost would have been almost double what we see here. So let's look at some of the pictures. Destruction along the coast, the West Hampton, Long Island. So this is, it's quite remarkable. It says, I said two things this says. One is the nature of the storm, and I think this is also a reflection of the nature of the construction. And we have to keep that in mind when you see some of the wreckage and trains blown off tracks and things like that. It's the nature of the infrastructure at the time. This is from a Red Cross book. In terms of Red Cross was very important in terms of the response to this storm. But you see folks picking through the wreckage, and at this point they were looking for bodies. They weren't in a full recovery mode here. I had to find the one for the Shinnecock Canal. I mean, I heard enough about it as I was growing up. But there's the wash, and you can see what would happen now if there were houses actually in these overwash areas. And that inlet was then fortified. There were other cuts as well, but they let natural forces fill those in. But this is the one that they kept open. Southampton, I showed this just in terms of showing how the houses got, in this case, a house got washed off of its foundation, wound up in the inlet itself. In East Hampton, this is a derailed train, not as catastrophic as what we saw from the 35 hurricane, but then again, this wasn't a Cat 5. Now, I told you I did a lot of reading on this. I don't normally read about movie stars, but I found this book, one of the last visits I had to my mom's house. She had this book, and I was reading it. And they had this whole section on her experience up in Rhode Island. She was along the Rhode Island coast with respect to the storm, and it obviously made quite an impact. Now, let's see if I can get this. Now, I'm not saying that she wrote this, okay? I mean, this was written by Ann Edwards. But, it was almost like this was written for a movie, okay? But it does point to the incredible, not only impact of the storm, but the surprise. I thought this was one of the best descriptions. They were out on by their beach house and the like. To mention that no severe storm watch had been issued, but no mention had been made of an approaching hurricane, okay? And she had gone out in this storm, basically to see what was going on, and then got caught up in it. The Fenwick is their house that they owned out there, was built as a summer cottage. By the time they went out and came back, the cottage itself was being destroyed. And then she wound up, with her, I guess it would be a lady with her that's taking care of her. They noticed that they had to get into a neighbor's more protected house. They were safe, but Fenwick was lost. That's the name of the house that they were in. It was a long history within their family, along with many other summer homes and the lives of two neighbors. So lost two neighbors on that, and it was noted that Rhode Island actually had the highest death toll out of the whole. And Kate left her mother and walked, fighting the winds, to the main street of town, good distance in any weather, to tell her father that the house had been lost. Okay? So, total surprise. These folks, very intelligent people, thinking they're going out into a normal storm, see what it's like out there. I think, how many people have driven to Jones Beach when they hear a hurricane's coming up just to see the waves? Come on, raise your hands. Be honest about it, all right? All right, so, and then they got caught up in this thing. So, that was the other thing we used to do, parking lot 6. All right, great view of the ocean rolling in. Okay, so, but the other thing that happened in Rhode Island was this storm was coming up a little bit later. People left their offices thinking that they were going to go to their cars or walk home, and the water's starting to rise, and all of a sudden the surge hits. So a lot of people who got killed in Rhode Island were killed in the city, people leaving work. And there are all kinds of stories about they were rescued as ropes were thrown out from second-story windows of office buildings to get back up into the building. They could not enter the building anymore on the first story. So when we talk about impact, if you're not prepared at all, you're psychologically not even thinking about this, this is the kind of stuff that happens. We know what happens when you don't have a forecast or a warning for a hurricane. This is what happens, okay? So now we get the inland flooding. This is Hartford and Norwich, Connecticut. Some of the, I think there's still some of the records. Dave Valley might be able to help me here, but I think some of the records that were set here still stand for the river. So it's not just the surge and the wind along the coast. It's the inland rainfall and then the subsequent flooding. Again, Onset, Massachusetts. Get into southeast Massachusetts. You could see the incredible destruction. City Point, Boston. Right, everything destroyed. Now, one of the big surprises I had was this Fisher Museum. It's the Harvard Forest. It's in north central Massachusetts. It's along Route 2. And we just stopped there one time, cutting across Massachusetts and driving towards Albany. And we went in and looked, and they got these pictures of the damage from this storm. And they decided at that point, for a large part of the area that Harvard controlled through this museum, just to leave it and study it as a recovering one. But this was original growth, and it was absolutely devastated. And you see the size of these trees that were just slashed, uprooted, cut in half. It was just amazing to see that. Of course, all the leaves were still out, so these were like the big catcher's mitt for these kinds of winds. And with the accelerating storms inland, this was still hurricane-force winds all the way into central Massachusetts. In fact, Blue Hill, which is just southwest of Boston, their record wind and wind gust were from this storm. Okay, so it gives you an illustration of what was happening inland. And if that doesn't help you, here's one of these before and after shots in Keene, New Hampshire. All right. So this thing was sort of like Harvey hitting South Carolina. There were hurricane-force winds all the way to the Appalachian Mountains, and it took basically just was like it just took every tree down as it moved inland. So incredible damage from this storm. Okay, the aftermath. The New Deal programs were mentioned. Roosevelt, does his radio broadcast, actually did a broadcast on successful working together in October of 14th, 1938, and used this storm and the response to it from both, not only from the government programs, but from the private sector and the nonprofits, the relief organizations like the Red Cross, were all highlighted in terms of working together. So the president's speech, one of his fireside chats, was actually directed at the response to this program. And, he emphasized the work is still going on, the Red Cross, WPA. Some of these acronyms I actually don't know. So, I know we're all in government, we're all kind of guilty, okay? And then the Army engineers and other federal agencies, it involved thousands of people working months. And people converged into this area because, remember, their employment, they were looking for employment. They signed up, and they were put out there. And they were addressing the roads and railroad outage, the railroads between New York City and Boston were gone for at least a month, maybe even longer. By the way, this was a motivation for people to start taking planes, flying in planes from New York City to Boston. People really were afraid of flying. Well, that was really the fastest way, and for many the only way to go back and forth. Basic infrastructure, tree removal, orchard recovery. This all took months to years to rebuild and restore. Now, this is kind of interesting here. The 2 billion trees across New York were ripped from the ground, leveling old-growth forests. When war broke out in Europe, much of the lumber was used to build military barracks and the interiors of transport ships from the wood. And we'll see some of this. So here's an illustration of the railroad along the coast, the high-speed Bostonian, and on the famous shoreline route and the New Haven Railroad. All that had to be rebuilt and restored. We had the Red Cross assisted hundreds of families to repair or rebuild their destroyed or damaged homes. Trying to rebuild the electric infrastructure. This took months. This sort of reminds me of what was going on in Puerto Rico after Maria, except in Puerto Rico, it wasn't just what was above ground that was destroyed. It was a lot of things below ground. The whole infrastructure was destroyed in Puerto Rico. This is interesting. The female lumberjacks carrying logs at Turkey Pond, New Hampshire, as part of an experimental project to saw up the 7 million feet of lumber from the 1938 hurricane. And you can see the way, this is now at Harvard Forest, when they worked these areas, they just stored them in these ponds for use over the next several years. So it's really interesting the way this operated as well. Oops. Okay. This thing's frozen up, folks. Okay. Just hit that? Okay. All right, so let's go to the forecast. Yeah, let's hit the next one. Okay. So let's set the scene for the forecast before we go in and try to, dissect the folks who were involved in this effort. First of all, the director of the Weather Bureau died 1 week before the storm unexpectedly. He was at a conference in Chicago, and he died there. And this shocked many Weather Bureau employees. Now, there's no direct evidence there's one-to-one, but I can tell you that there was a close-knit agency, and this certainly had an effect on people and would be on people's minds. Now, Greg actually was the one who was initiating this change in the forecast process from climatology and persistence to a more dynamic air mass and fronts. And I think there was one slide about the Weather Bureau being kind of slow to change. We all look at fronts now and all that stuff, and we think that would be roundly accepted. It was a battle to even accept that kind of a change. Greg actually initiated that, before he died. So the change was from persistence in climatology based entirely on surface data when it was available. And that's why people thought, hey, most of these storms turn to the right. Storms never hit Long Island, and if they do, they're weakening. That's all persistence in climatology, okay? To an air mass and fronts, use of dynamics included upper air data. There was actually upper air data taken to about 15,000 feet. I didn't realize that upper air data was taken that early in the process. So, and being employed for the first time. Now, there were forecast centers, Jacksonville, that we were going to focus on, Jacksonville, Florida. And the lead forecaster there was Grady Norton. He's widely known and revered by the tropical meteorologists. And then in Washington, D.C., this Charles Mitchell is also very well known, and there are awards named after both these guys. The analyst here, the lead analyst, Gordon Dunn, down in Jacksonville, he became the director that eventually got us to the National Hurricane Center, and then Charles Pierce, and you've already seen his maps, okay? So he's a new analyst, schooled in the air mass in front. So you're seeing these boundaries in his. This is all new, okay? Yeah, hit the next one. Okay, so the way the forecast offices worked was there was an office in Puerto Rico, Jacksonville, and Washington that would handle these storms as they went, transferred across the Atlantic, approached Florida, Jacksonville, take over, and then when they got north of that line between North Carolina and Virginia, Washington, D.C. would take over. And remember, it's in that area that this storm is accelerating, okay? So we're not only dealing with an accelerating storm, which the Hurricane Center notoriously has had issues with, okay? It's crossing a boundary of forecast responsibility. Okay, next. And I love this picture. Boy, suits on forecast desks. Are you seeing this, guys and gals? Okay, suits. All right, I get a lot of stuff about always wearing a tie, So it also points to how rigid the process is. So you have these analysts working, plotting the maps, analyzing the maps, but they hand it to that lead forecaster who makes all the decisions. Period. Okay, and if you've got a different idea, you better have your facts behind you. If you're going to go up to Charles Mitchell and say, oh, by the way, this thing ain't turning to the right, it's accelerating up the coast. So this is I think a sign of the rigidity in the forecast process that probably played a role in not changing fast enough. Okay, because even as the storm was accelerating up the coast, they didn't know how close it was already getting to Long Island, even as they were reissuing the warnings at 11:30 in the morning. Okay, next. So here we go. You see this, you hit the next button. So here's the track. So the turn away from Florida was observed and conveyed with enough lead time to cause a celebration in Florida and within the national press and the New York Times. Now, the New York Times was mentioned on the 21st. the day that this storm hit Long Island, the lead story in the New York Times was about how Florida was spared. And they were all celebrating how the forecasters, was able to convey this information with enough lead time that, people could relax, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. The turn to the right was expected to continue as the storm passed Florida and Georgia, and there's this slight turn. Next. But as the storm accelerated up the coast, that didn't happen. Okay. So there was an anticipation about this turn to the right, but there was a realization, even as the responsibilities were being handed off, that the storm was actually closer to the coast on the morning of the 21st than was expected. So there were already warnings up along the coast, actually all the way up to Block Island, about the magnitude of the winds. But they weren't whole gale warnings at that point, and they were certainly not hurricane warnings. People weren't expecting the hurricanes. Okay, so this is, I call this, it's a type of an analog approach. I mentioned the climatology and persistence. Grady Norton issued the track forecast September 20th up towards North Carolina and up toward the East Coast with an expected turn to the right. Charles Mitchell assumes responsibility. He was a master practitioner. He was on duty. These folks are probably sleeping in the office, okay? They tracked the storm closer, and the storm warning was extended to Atlantic City. So there was a recognition this thing wasn't going off as far to the right. But on the morning of the 21st, they tracked the storm, et cetera, and they issued then the Block Island to Eastport, Maine, storm warnings. At 11:30 a.m., they issued a storm warning with whole gales for the first time for Long Island and New England, early afternoon, but no hurricane warning was issued. And the warnings arrived too late. By the time it got through the radios and all that, it just was too late for anybody to either hear it or know what was going on. Now, what's interesting about, and I was reading in your book about how the folks at the Blue Hill Observatory is one of my favorite places, by the way. These folks really are meticulous in all what they do in terms of documenting instrumentation, key forecasts, et cetera. They noticed on the morning of the 21st in southeast New England that the clouds were rushing in from the southeast to the northwest. And they actually wrote in their logs and tried to alert folks up in the New England area that this storm is not going out to sea, that it's going to come inland. Okay? So just this, when I talk with students and ask what can I do besides just looking at your phones and, finding things on the web, is get a cloud chart, look at the clouds. Clouds tell you everything, okay? So they actually were using cloud motions on the morning of the 21st to start alerting people that this storm is likely not making the right turn, right? Next. So I noted the new air mass frontal analysis would include surface and upper air data. It was underway. Charles Pierce was in the air mass group, and he was recently trained in the new techniques. They would conduct daily briefings at noon based on the AMS and fronts, but their forecasts, whatever they generated, just remained within that group. I don't know if there's any direct evidence that got to Mitchell, but Mitchell did alter his forecast at 11:30. But it was basically to put in an envelope for later review. That's where that work went, okay? So it indicated storm was not recovering but accelerating. It might have influenced, and the associated warnings for Long Island and New England as a whole gale. But there's no direct evidence that Mitchell actually used this work. Most of the recognition for this work is given in the post-storm analysis. Okay, next. And here's the acceleration. You can see how this was moving up. This is a 3.5-hour delta between 7:30 and 11. But then you have this noon. So between 11 and 2, it's already, approaching Long Island, which made landfall between 2 and 3 p.m. Just a remarkable acceleration, and the intensities certainly remained the same. And you're starting to see this extratropical structure with an inverted trough, probably a frontal zone that's developing along there, which helped concentrate the rain fall in the Connecticut area. Okay, next. The other thing he did was he used the upper air data, and we saw this earlier, to see how this storm was being captured. So all three maps are hand-drawn analysis based on the scarce upper air data, but he's really showing how this trough coming in basically captured that storm. And as we'll see later, that's what happened with Sandy. Different orientation, but this is exactly what happened with Sandy to pull it into New Jersey. So Pierce was analyzing what we now know is the extratropical transition of a tropical storm moving northward, and these are marked by rapid acceleration of the forward speed. Next. So again, out of Lord's book, she had these particular storms all composited, and you see where that center of that storm is in this composite. If we go to the next slide, here's the upper air maps from the reanalysis for this, and you see the deep trough. But for the folks who know what I'm interested in, been interested in my whole career, is what I call a jet streak, okay? Embedded in jet streams, these are finite length wind maxima. That's a jet streak. And what we're finding, and we see this, is that it's in the entrance region of the jet streaks that these storms accelerate in. And it literally draws the clouds up and precipitation up along into the entrance region on the right side of that type of a jet. For that to show up as a signal in a composite is extraordinary. And I can tell you on a case-to-case basis that I've looked at, this is a key thing that's often overlooked in terms of the movements of the storm. And along the eastern part of this trough, the trough line is you see this U-shaped trough. On the east side is where the temperature gradients are increasing in magnitude. This is an energy source for storms. So you now have a different energy source. It's not just the moisture coming in from below and feeding a hurricane. You've got this whole transformation from potential to kinetic energy, which is realized in these increasingly strong wind fields around the low. So it's really remarkable how that showed up. Okay, the fallout. So the Weather Bureau is severely criticized for lack of situational awareness. This was one of the key problems with the 35 storm and the 38 storm. In certain critical times, they lost track of even where the storm was, much less where it was going. All right? And so related to the changes in the storm track, intensity, and the acceleration. And the investigation recognized a complacency north of Cape Hatteras, and this is where it can't happen here. So when you talk about impacts, you got to understand whether the people are ready for something like this to happen. It's not just the physical attributes of the storm. Are they ready for it? They weren't ready for this one. Okay? Next. So now this ushered in, though, it's kind of interesting how these disasters lead to something really good. This actually ushered in the beginning of the Reichelderfer era. Francis Reichelderfer was named the head of the Weather Bureau in December of 1938. He was known as a game changer, and he certainly, hit the ground running with this. Accelerated, they went through all the reviews, accelerated the transition to air mass front concepts as a basis for analysis and forecasting. There's a novel that was written about a storm hit in California. It's called Storm. And the author, Stewart, actually spent a year in the San Francisco forecast office, and he describes how the young forecasters or analysts are arguing with the older ones about the importance of this. It's kind of interesting to see the same dynamic happening with the changes, some of the changes we do today. But listen, look what he brought to the table in his career. He established the Radiosonde network in the United States. It was based on aviation, the growing commercial aviation. He was either the first or second president of the World Meteorological Organization, so he's also responsible for the global Radiosonde network. That was postponed by the war, of course, after World War II. This was one of the first things that we coordinated internationally through the World Meteorological Organization. Established the radar network in the United States in the 1950s. He's the one who embraced numerical modeling. I'm not sure many folks in the Weather Bureau would have embraced numerical modeling in 1950s. He basically took the computer from, Census was part of the Department of Commerce. We were now part of the Department of Commerce. Census didn't know what to do with its computers after the 1950 census. And he said, I know what to do with the computers. So That's how we became the second country in the world, Sweden was the first, to run real-time numerical models. We sustained it. So to think about how you get not just those analyses done, but how do you get it done in real time to feed the models in real time was a major engineering task that was also done under his watch. And then he embraced the satellite imagery that was coming to fore in the early 60s, just before he retired. So here we are today. And I want you to know that everything you read, see, hear about weather, climate, and ocean forecast is based on numerical prediction models. That's not the end of the story, but it's the basis for the modern forecast process. So global observations are an important part of this. You can't make a local forecast without global observations, dominated by the international satellite network. So we ingest about 2 billion observations a day to feed our numerical models. The geostationary satellite for situational awareness was driven by the hurricane needs. Hurricane and severe storms drove the requirements for geostationary satellite, and I'll show you an example from Harvey and how far we've come. The next step is data assimilation, modeling, and science. Data assimilation is extracting the useful information from every data source we've got. And every data source has strengths and weaknesses. So data assimilation is based on variational analysis. It builds on the strength of observing systems while avoiding the weaknesses. That feeds into the modeling. Major science effort to make that work, and mathematics were basically redefined from continuous calculus to discrete mathematics that could be programmed onto a computer, right? That's really important to understand, okay? You can't solve these problems in a continuous framework. You can't even solve the pendulum problem in a continuous mathematical framework, but you can when you go to the discrete mathematics, okay? That was all done. Go up, back. I know it's going to get a little long, folks. Supercomputers. We drove the entire supercomputer industry in the 1950s and 60s. Seymour Cray, when he came to Washington, stopped at 2 places. He stopped at our place first and then went to the National Security Agency for code breaking. Those were the 2 basic things that drove supercomputers, but the magnitude of the computation first was us. Okay, now we have a primary and backup. We're up to about 3 petaflops. We've just upgraded to about 4 petaflops per computer with 99.9% reliability. And then the forecaster skill is that they make the call. And these models are not perfect. When I work with the emergency managers, I tell the one thing I can guarantee you every time is I can't give you a perfect forecast, but we'll give you the best if you're working with our forecasters. Because these models still, they operate within an envelope. They're not giving you an exact forecast. So we got to make that work. I contend that putting this together at the second half of the 20th century was one of the intellectual achievements of the 20th century. And some of the people who worked the atomic bomb, in John von Neumann especially, was a critical part of making this happen as well. So he was involved in 2 of the intellectual achievements of the 20th century. Okay, next. So today, round the clock, it includes not just the Weather Service, but an entire weather enterprise, public-private sector. We sustain 24/7 situational awareness. We have forecasts for extreme events that now extend out to 8 to 10 days in advance based on ensemble modeling. And then we have an all-hands-on-deck during extreme events throughout the Weather Service, throughout the enterprise, forecasters connected to decision-making. That's what's happening today. That was not in place at all in 1938. Okay, next. Within the Weather Service, we have local forecast offices all the way from Guam to Puerto Rico. That's a pretty big space to be responsible for, I can tell you. Alaska, Hawaii to Key West. We have a number of centers. I think the Hurricane Center, Weather Prediction Center, Storm Prediction Center. Should also note the Ocean Prediction Center is playing an increasing role as well. So this is just a few of the centers that I'm noting here, but they all play a role in our hurricane forecast as storms approach the U.S. Right, next. So this is what a satellite image looks like now. This is 1-minute data from the new GOES system. This was Hurricane Harvey. As this was happening in real time, I was getting phone calls from the Hurricane Center at my house saying, I can't believe what we're seeing. Okay? This I formation, this was going from a 2 to a 4 as that storm was approaching the Texas coast. And for those who really keep track of this thing, we were forecasting an intensification maybe to a 3. But as we watched this, we knew we had a problem on our hand. The other thing is, Corpus Christi, which is right up in that area where the landfall is occurring, they were co-located with the emergency management community and the local first responders. We were timing when that eye wall was going to cross the coast so the first responders could get out to the barrier islands where people were texting in when they still had their connectivity, that they were in dire shape, they needed help, so they were pinpointing where all these people were. We were telling them when they could get out there, how long they were going to have, and when they would have to get back based on this 1-minute imagery. And I talked to the fire chief who ran that whole operation, said at a minimum, they saved 275 lives just based on this imagery and having the situational awareness on a minute-by-minute basis. So think about 1938, where they couldn't even keep track of the storm, and something like this, where you're working with emergency managers and first responders on a minute-by-minute basis. Okay, next. Now, this is a quote from Bob Sheets that he wrote in Weather and Forecasting in June 1990. If you hit the next one, he'll tell you how important this data is. Right? You can go through all the requirements, processes, and do cost-benefit relations. But when you get this from the director of the Hurricane Center, saying that if he only had one choice for an observing system, that would be it. Okay? And that's because this is what is giving you the continuous observations of the storms and the situational awareness you need to have to understand how these storms are changing with time. And next. By the way, that's the reason I went to Wisconsin to go work, because Vern Sumi was mentioned. Vern Sumi is the father of satellites. He's the first one to promote geostationary satellites. And I got to work with him for I didn't work under him for my degrees, but I worked with him and then did a postdoc under him before I went to NASA. That was a dream back in the early 70s. Here's the model suite. This is what the quiz is going to be on. All right? We predict, every day, we predict out to seasons in advance, 4 times a day. We create ensemble systems and then try to extract the best forecast from them. So you see all these ensemble systems, North American ensemble, that's out to day 16. The global ensemble forecast system is our component of that. Short-range ensembles. We have hurricane models now that are part of ensemble systems. This is what's giving the forecasters the confidence when they see a collection of forecasts doing the same thing from time to time to start working with emergency managers 7, 8, 9, 10 days in advance, that we got to start thinking about something happening. And then as you actually approach it a week in advance, days, hours, you have the confidence levels because you're continuing getting now the same forecast churn. That's what's allowing us to work with emergency managers a week in advance, that they pre-position assets. So you see these examples with fast boat rescues for these flash floods. They've been out there for 1 or 2 days pre-positioning based on our forecast. That's how they get out there that fast. Okay? Next. So you see, this is for Hurricane Irma. These are a sequence of model forecasts that are made during the course of Irma. And then you see the track of Irma in black. And I got to tell you, that right-hand turn into Florida, you message that in real time, okay? Like we had to do. 6.5 days, 5.5 days, 4.5 days before the event, okay? Can only do it because of these models that allow us to get them ready. And that impacted the entire state of Florida. And that is a right-hand turn that we were believing in 4 days before the event. Yeah, we can argue east side of Florida, west side of Florida. That's the envelope that we were working with. Next. So that's an actual model. That's the hurricane model right there. That's not the actual hurricane. That's a numerical simulation. And then there's Maria. No, that was Jose, I think. I'm trying to remember which one. There were 2 of them that were playing around out there. But the focus with the color, that's a simulated radar from a 5-day forecast from the hurricane model. And then here's the actual winds that would come up. So the models picked up Irma before it was a tropical depression. It indicated the threat for southeastern U.S. 8 to 10 days in advance. The sharp right turn to the north was expected based on the strong ensemble agreement. Florida declared a state of emergency on Monday, 6 days before landfall. Unheard of. When the governor did that, we were like white-knuckled, okay? But they had to because it was affecting the entire state, and they needed an orderly evacuation from Key West all the way up the Keys. And the only way you can get that, it takes 3 days to do that. That's why they had to start that tick-tock at day 6. Okay. And then the forecast to the right, turn verified. Okay, next. This is the satellite imagery for Maria. It's always beautiful to watch until you realize the destruction. And there's the rapid spin up to a Cat 5. You can see that. And then right across the entire island, the island did its number on it. You can see how a hurricane interacts even when it's hitting an island with any kind of mountains. And then it went on up the East Coast, okay? And it became a real interesting forecast problem up there. Next. So here's the actual forecast that were made by the Hurricane Center. And you can see they had to track. You just follow that yellow dot. That's the actual, right across the entire island of Puerto Rico. Now watch what happens up here. All right? We thought, hey, it looks like a right turn. And it finally made that right turn, but there was a lot of uncertainty. And for those involved in emergency management here in this part, there was a lot of nervousness in New York, New Jersey, and the Mid-Atlantic region about that storm. So, the story wasn't over from a forecast point of view with Puerto Rico. Notice how there was that first, and they shifted it back towards the west. But then they were very confident, notice the really narrow cone of uncertainty, that this thing was going to turn to the right, and it did. So we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, next. This is Florence. This is the actual global model that the GFS. I know this is a shock to everybody. All right, let's just get over this. This had the highest scores. It beat the European model for Florence. We didn't hear all the naysayers on this one. But the fact is, our forecasters access all the models. We use everything, European, UK Met, Canadian, Navy, our models, ensembles, deterministic run. They use them all. What's really remarkable is when we go through the sequence again, look how it hit the coast, went to the south, and then made that turn. This was initialized on the 12th, okay, and got all the way into the 19th. So it's a 5-day forecast. So yeah, you can see it moving, and at first, this particular model, was one of the first runs, 5-6 days in advance for this model system to actually hit the coast, stall. That's rainfall, very heavy rainfall rates associated with that, and you can see it just sitting there. So now our attention is turning to the rainfall forecast. Next. This is the actual sequence of official forecasts made as we started tracking the storm across so at this point it's still being forecast as a tropical storm. There was initial evidence it was going to turn. The model starts saying no, it's going to lose that, the influence of the high. And it comes right in. This is the one that got written up, intersecting the coast within 2 miles. And you see, at first we thought it was going to go in, and then we started shifting it down with a large cone of uncertainty, much larger here. But we made that turn well before it made landfall. And then we had it sitting there. Look how short distance it's traveling on a daily basis. Just that slow movement. Okay, next. So here's our surge forecast. And you notice this is the general heights that we put out. Hit the next one. This is the actual models that we use that show, the yellow is greater than 3 feet, the orange is greater than 6 feet, and then the red is greater than 9 feet. And with these rivers going up, the highest surge is actually upstream. And this is what we were messaging during the storm. It's not just what happens along the coast. So I want to emphasize, as far as we know right now, 0 lives were lost in the surge. Okay? This was the #1 killer for hurricanes. It's the storm surge. 0 lives. Okay, next. Here's the rainfall. This is the rainfall forecast, 5-day forecast, and this is the verification. I think the biggest issue we had for the forecast verification is actually Southeast Virginia, where the maximum rainfall occurred with respect to the track of the storm. We really nailed it. Communicating this threat is our biggest challenge. So I don't know if people have heard this, when they do surveys on people, first they tell them, close your eyes and think of a hurricane. What's the first thing you think of? And 96 or 7% say wind. Trying to get them focused on inland flooding is a major, major challenge. All right, we can't underestimate that. Okay, next. Here we're doing the river forecast along points of specific rivers, getting into record territory, into their purples. We were getting this information out days in advance. And by the way, we're still dealing with flooding in South Carolina and North Carolina on this storm. Okay, next. All right, Paul, and Harvey, this is for you. This is your chart. Okay, these are 2 of our retirees that worked the Marine program. How many people remember with Joaquin, the El Faro tanker just at full steam ahead, just went right across? That changed everything. All right, it went down, and we had the safety review on that, and people pointed to the Ocean Prediction Center and the forecast that they do in coordination with the Hurricane Center, and the Hurricane Center has what they call a TAFB. They got a unit that deals with the same types of things south. This is the warned area for Florence. Not one ship in the warned area. All hanging around down here, hanging around up there, hanging around, but not in the warning area. Paul, did you think you'd ever see the day? Because these ship captains, they got one thing in mind, is A to B, time is money. Okay? Not one ship. Yes, everything. This is everything. And I'll just leave it at that. Okay? Next. All right, future is now. This is the last part of it. Building a weather-ready nation. Next. So when I took over in 2013, I actually was the head of the strategic planning team. In 2011, I came up with this goal. I didn't personally come up with the goal of a built weather-ready nation. Marie Laverne did it, not a meteorologist, which was very helpful because she lectured us as meteorologists, that our outcome had to be societal, not, hey, I'm going to get that close to track and that close to intensity, okay? So the idea is about building community resiliency in the face of increasing vulnerability to extreme weather, water, and climate events. We've got increasing population living along the coast, Tornado Alley, fire areas in the western third of the country. We're doubling the population in these areas. And it takes longer than to deal with evacuations and things like that. We touch every county every day. We're supporting national security. We're actually officially now supporting national security and public safety. So what we need are better forecasts and warnings, but we need consistency, and it's not an either or. If our forecast officers are all predicting different things, our emergency management partners walk. Okay? It just leads to confusion. So we have to be consistent, and we're building that consistency into our private sector partners through these Weather Ready Nation ambassadors. We can't tell everybody what to say, but the fact is, we now share information before we release our forecast. We take information from anybody who has information to offer it that brings insight into what's happening with a situation. We need to make it actionable environmental. We have to map it to people's key decision points. So this is a revolutionary change in connecting forecasts to warnings and warnings to decisions. That's the key thing. Our job doesn't end with the forecast and warning. This is a sea change for people working in the Weather Service. Okay, next. So we have this thing called impact-based decision support services, and what we're learning, and we have people from the emergency operations centers here today, and they'll tell you, it's what happens the year before, the month before. It's the practice that makes it building those relationships, because they know they're not going to get a perfect forecast from them. So when we're saying something really bad's going to happen and they're looking at our eyes, they know something bad's going to happen, okay? And they'll make those decisions 6, 5, 4, 3 days in advance that they would not make without those kind of relationships. So, and we're invited into their space, we give them the information they need. So it's connecting those forecasts and warnings with partner decisions, and that whole making process, that's what gives, that's the definition for the impact-based decision support services. That's how we realize the intrinsic value and mission success, by building up that trust. Next. So just to give you an idea of how this has worked, we mentioned Andrew in 1992. That is another Cat 5 storm that made landfall, one of the few. It took 4 days after landfall for the national, state, and locals to be fully mobilized to address the destruction and the situation. 4 days after. Okay? For Katrina, we had, I would call it variable connectivity. Some states were better prepared than others. Louisiana was not prepared, even in real time. Okay? And down to the local levels. We're not just talking the state, we're talking the parish, down to the sea levels. And some of the other states weren't that far behind. And there was not a uniformed way of doing it. We have a much more systematic way now. Entire weather service connected to national, state, local emergency water resource managers. We embed at every government level, including the local level. Ready, set, go with the emergency management community 7 days in advance. And that's the key, if they can stay ahead of the planning. All hands on deck to support field operations. So we're testing every single one of, we review every system we have every day. When we have a bed, like in Harvey, there were 3 radio towers out. We were on the phone to Verizon 5 days before Harvey to get those addressed. Okay? Those kind of things were going on. Consistent messaging, we have what we call a collaborative forecast process. We're not having a battle between one local office and the other, or the local offices and the centers. So this is what's working. That's what made Florida make that decision 6.5 days before landfall, as an example. Next. Okay. Can these storms happen again? Next. Yes. It's going to happen again, folks. And in fact, I think Sandy is a good example that it did happen. All right? I had a message that Chris was setting up the comms. Rick Nebb was down at the White House. So I had the joy of doing 2 days of messaging on this with Craig Fugate sitting by my side as the FEMA director. I was the head of the national centers at the time. You try to tell people in New Jersey that experienced Irene the year before, that went up parallel to the coast, and they got that much of a storm surge, that much. Jim Cantore was on a dock in New York filming his shoes to see if the water was going to get above his shoes. This is what we were up against with communicating Sandy, okay? Because we got them all spun up for storm surge, for Irene, and sort of mentioned inland flooding. I know the RFCs and some of the local offices were emphasizing the inland flooding up in New York and Vermont, but uniformly the messaging wasn't getting through, right? Okay, so let me just see something here. Hold on. Yeah, so this is Sandy. Notice, don't have the resolution. This is the older satellites. Okay, now here's the track forecast that actually showed a turn. This is the first forecast that showed this kind of motion out and then in. Watch how it accelerates into New Jersey. Bam! That makes a difference, folks. That's point number 1. Point number 2, which wasn't mentioned today, there was a 1,500-mile fetch from east to west, north of Sandy, because of the high over New England that built out into the Atlantic. So this thing just focused that fetch right into New York Harbor. And this was the problem we were having. we predicted 11-foot rise in water, which was a record. That was a record forecast. And anybody in the Weather Service will tell you, when you're predicting a record, you get pretty nervous, all right? And we had Irene the year before, and we're saying, it's going to be 11 feet. It's going to be 11 feet. It's going to be 11 feet. It was the Port Authority that convinced the mayor to take action, close the subways down. And it got up to 14 feet, by the way. Got up to 14 feet. Remember what else happened in Queens when that water hit? Everybody remember the fires? It looked like it was hell on earth. So this was pretty bad, okay? The other thing that struck me about Sandy was Long Island had about 30 hours of hurricane-force winds in parts of Long Island. No rain. Zero rain. It was the gradient between the high and the storm, okay? So this thing was really an amazing system, and trying to message this to get the response was an incredibly hard job. It would be easier today. We've got partnerships with emergency managers up and down the coast, et cetera, et cetera. But it was not an easy task to do. And I can tell you, I think we did well with Long Island. I was amazed that Fire Island actually evacuated. I actually made a comment to Fugate after one of our sessions. I said, they'll never evacuate Fire Island. These folks aren't going to leave. They all laughed. I don't know how you did it, okay? We underestimated Staten Island. This thing just plowed water right into Staten Island, and we underestimated the amount of water coming in off of Long Island, the Long Island Sound, and hitting that bight and then going around. We just basically stopping the Hudson River in its tracks, okay? So a lot of work to be done, but imagine if this were 50 miles further north, we certainly would have been hearing about a lot more deaths. All right, next. I'll just point this out again. The best forecast scores out of Sandy were not the European model, was not the American model. It was the official forecast issued by the forecasters at the National Hurricane Center, and the day 6 and 7 day forecast off of what's now the Weather Prediction Center. And they're the ones who did that out and then in. The European Center came straight up the coast, and the GFS went off this way, but the ensembles was showing that this was a possibility, and that's what the forecasters went with. All right? All right, next. So, last thing is, this is great success. I think we do have the 24/7 situational awareness. We have incredible forecast skills. We've got partnerships. Right? We've got partners sitting right here in the audience now. But nature can have the last word. So you see Puerto Rico before and after. This is a measure, in my mind, of the sheer magnitude on the infrastructure. And again, it was the electric grid, it was the fresh water supply system, it was the sewers. Sewers were just blown up. The amount of water that went into the sewers just literally blew the pipes. Okay, that's what they're dealing with. And if this doesn't grab you, next. That's our radar. That's not supposed to happen to our radar. Okay, so it was shredded. We had a remarkable partnership with the Marines and the Navy. We got 3 X-band radars deployed to Puerto Rico, which allowed us to get measurements over Puerto Rico, radar coverage, while we rebuilt this. Now, this is an FAA radar that we manage. It's part of our network. And we got that back on, I think, in the July timeframe of the next season. Right? Again, a remarkable partnership. But what delayed getting this thing fixed, by the way, which also delayed a lot of the work that was being done inside of Puerto Rico by Puerto Rican, was the magnitude of the damage to the roads and the trees shredded. You see that picture of Keene, New Hampshire? That was the entire island of Puerto Rico after that event. Next, last slide. So, I think the 38th storm is a storm for the ages. It certainly was, like I said, from the ages point of view of our family, it certainly influenced the family law. It sets the standard for ultimate destruction, societal impact, the family law. I'm sure everybody's got their own stories. From the aftermath, we know now that it's a baseline for where we were, where we didn't have the situational awareness, where we didn't have the forecast capacity to even make a credible 12-hour forecast on accelerating storms, as an example. This was a wake-up call for the Weather Bureau that we needed, It actually was the basis for the changes that followed. I didn't realize how much this storm influenced to what today is a modern forecast process. So what Reichelderfer, I also worked for Conrad Lattenbacher, Reichelderfer put in place is the basis for the modern forecast process. So today we're leading the way in building a weather-ready nation, and we have partnerships across the entire emergency management, water resource management enterprise, federal, state, and local. Most decisions are made at the local level and at the personal level. By the way, you have one of these? Everybody have one of these? All right? You're a decision maker. All right? So we're all over the place, and you're downloading our stuff, and you're saying, I don't know what the hell they're doing. So you're going to go someplace else, right? So this is a problem this is an opportunity and a problem, okay? But it does force us into a more consistent product and service line, which I think is absolutely essential. We're better prepared than ever to observe, predict, warn, prepare, but you can't let your guard down, right? It's really up to you. I mean, your local officials can't force you to evacuate in most places. When you refuse to go, they ask you to write your social security number on your arm so they can identify you afterwards, right? That kind of stuff, right? They can't force you. So it's your decision. You better have a plan in the face of this. Now, before I get to the thank you slide here, I recognize one of my teachers here in the audience. Al Blau, will you please stand up? Yeah, so he's a earth science teacher, also a wrestling coach. He recognized very early that I was not a wrestler. So I became the timekeeper and manager for a year. But anyway, Al, I want to thank you for what you did help me along, and I hope I'll pass your quiz at the end of the day. So thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause. Teachers are everything. Okay, so the last slide. Just want to thank you, and I'll answer any questions that we might have.
Okay, so we have time for a couple of quick questions.
Yeah, and the last thing is just a nice satellite, loop. You can hit that one. This is the entire 2017, so you can relive 2017. Let's see if we can.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay. If you got questions, you have to come up to the mic. All right, because they're live streaming this, and so come on up. You had your hand up. Come on up to the mic. And identify yourself too, please. That'd be very helpful.
Thank you, Doctor. My name is Tom O'Hara. I recently retired from the Office of Emergency Management in Suffolk County. And I want to not let this opportunity pass to tell you, your embedding, you pointed out about the evacuation of Fire Island.
Yep.
There is a direct connect of your embedding of your staff that gave us the confidence on Saturday. It was a Tuesday storm for Sandy. They gave us after the misfire of Irene. I just kept walking around going two in a row. But it was your embedding that gave us the confidence to make the decision very early.
Right. And
the evacuation in the Suffolk County portion of Fire Island was down to 50 people were left on the island the night of the storm. As a matter of fact, the next morning, as sunup was coming, I'm walking around saying, what are we wasting our time with these 50 people? We have 5,000 people without a home. But it was definitely your embedding gave us at least one, maybe two operational periods to, with confidence, to go make the call. So keep embedding. It's the smart thing to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you for making that connection. I just want to say is that we, for those others in the audience, we don't invite ourselves into their space.
No, you didn't.
That's right. So the fact that we're embedded is because we put in our time with them on their terms in terms of trying to understand what goes into their key decision process.
Bob Wiley and Gary Conti.
Right. So
they're the ones.
Yep. So anyway, thank you for bringing that forward.
Any other questions?
Hi there. My name is Patricia Kitchen. I'm a reporter with Newsday. And I wanted to ask about something a little bit forward-looking here, about the categories of hurricanes. I know you've mentioned, and so many people have mentioned and helped educate me, that winds, yes, winds are there, but that's not always going to be the big problem, that each storm is completely different. Some are stronger in some areas than others, and so I know there's been talk about possibly revising the category system to include or to put back in mention of surge. I understand that actually it had been including some surge. Right. So could you just address that? What's challenging about that, and also what the prospects would be for that?
Okay. So if I may, the first thing to keep in mind is that the categories that we have for hurricanes and tornadoes are really impact scales. So it's the designation from a 1 to a 2 to a 2 to a 3, et cetera, are based on very detailed engineering studies of the impact of winds on buildings. So it's not an intensity scale, but it's literally an impact scale. With the focus on winds, generally that's the like we just heard about the history of hurricanes, that's what drives the whole lore of hurricanes is winds. And like I said, people, when you mention hurricane to people, the first thing that they think about are winds. So we can't be critical of the impact scale that we have for hurricanes and tornadoes, but can we add to it? Right? And that's, I think, the discussion. So in Katrina, let's look at Katrina as an example. That storm went from a 5 to a 3 between its maximum intensity in the central Gulf of Mexico and making landfall next to near New Orleans. And as it was decreasing to a 3, Max Mayfield realized he had a big problem on his hands, because people were saying, why did we evacuate? It's down to a 3. We can handle a 3, right? We knew the surge was going to be, we were already doing some experimenting with surge, but as we found out after the storm, and that surge was amazing. Not only did it knock out the eastern part of New Orleans, but if anybody saw the pictures of the Mississippi coast after Katrina, you would have thought that a tsunami had hit southern Mississippi, okay? So we spent years, first of all, getting our models for the surges, having a separate testing how to represent those models. We had social scientists, even the color code, even how you define a surge. Because as scientists, we define a surge above, normal sea level or something like that. People want, here's my driveway, here's the ground. Is the water going to be on that ground or not? They want it to the street level, all right? So we had to do it as above ground, get all the models. So that surge that I showed you with that color scheme is the result of that. And we now have a separate watch warning for surge. We recognize that as we dealt with this, and surge killed more people than anybody else, okay? So we recognize that now we're seeing, so there have been papers written about the threat of inland flooding, the blue sky deaths after the storm passes by. That this is a critical area, and it's and that flooding, especially the flash flooding, tends to be more localized and all that. So we're now trying to come to grips with how to message that. It really comes down to how to message the risk involved and how to put it together far enough in time. And we are experimenting with a way, they call it a dashboard, where you have the risk on one side and you have a color scheme across the top, and there's some debate about whether it should be green, yellow, red, or green, yellow, orange, red. The Europeans use the 4-color system. So we're looking at that. But that's a risk assessment tool. It's not an intensity tool, and it's not necessarily an impact tool. But we believe that it's this risk assessment and being able to advertise that more effectively early enough that people will understand, I don't have to worry about wind where I am, but I got to worry about, inland flooding. The flooding aspect of it is the thing that we're trying to come to grips with. We were messaging the flooding, the catastrophic flooding, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 day in advance of Florence. We learned our lesson from Matthew, working with the government in North Carolina about messaging this thing more effectively. We were doing that, North and South Carolina. But there's still a lot of, that they didn't get the message, somehow the people didn't get the message. So we got to go back. We are going back and looking at that in terms of a risk assessment.
And this will be our last question.
Actually, Craig Allen, WCBS. Patricia's question actually was one of mine, and you answered it with other answers to other questions that I had. But in terms of weather-ready nation, now you've got this idea ingrained in their head about a Category 1, Category 2, and you want to, get across the surge of the rainfall. What if we experimented with a double-categoried storm? In other words, a 2-1 or a 2-4. Do you think that would be too confusing to the public? And then you have to deal with something like when Sandy hit by me on the South Shore, I didn't even get an inch of rain, and yet I had 9 feet of water going down the streets from off the ocean. Right. So you're now trying to say, well, in terms of rainfall, this is going to be a Category 3 type rainfall storm, but it wasn't by me. So you've got all these variables in there. But the other part of the question is that if we're trying to be weather ready, the big thing that I'm worried about is if so much information is put out there as broadcasters and as OEM people here, can there be too much information? Because what happens with the social media is that you get bombarded with wrong information out there. So I want you to see if you could address that. And also the problem that we had with the political decisions with Sandy. As you said, if it wasn't for the Port Authority, if it wasn't for our OEM people here, the mayor wanted everybody to stay because he heard exactly what you just told us, that, Sandy's not even going to be tropical anymore. She's going into the coast, and therefore I think we're going to be safe. We're basically a quote. So how do you get around, and how do you get everybody to work together for something like that?
Okay, well, what we learned from Sandy was that embedding works again. In New York City, we were there to make that point and hammer home the record nature of the surge. This is not an easy problem, but I think in terms of if we get back to the risk dashboard idea, you can actually get that pretty well mapped out. I think you can communicate that message more effectively than trying to go through just each one individually. People ask questions about, what's making that a red? Then you answer that question, because maybe, they think they're less vulnerable for whatever reason. You're still going to have to interact with them. But we got to deal with the risks of these systems that they pose in a more effective way. It's very clear that we have to do that. And it isn't just the wind that offers itself a risk. With respect to being exhausted before an event, I heard, I could tell you during the snowstorms when we had that 2016 snowstorm when we were out there 5, 4, 3, 2 days before the event. I know I woke up the morning of the event and I said, it better happen, first of all. Secondly, was the sense of exhaustion that people, and you'll have the naysayers out there about overhyping an event, which is one of the reasons we did a press conference the day before the storm to say, hey, this is going to be a dangerous blizzard. We emphasized the risk, all the hazards, the along the coast. There was, I'm talking about the January 2016 storm. It was all the above. It was wind, snow, and the coastal flooding. And we had to communicate that day after day, and to bring that point home. So that's part of the challenge that we have when you have people at risk like that. So.
All right, let's have one more round of applause for our keynote speaker. We are out of time.